Welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next with Rabbi Ken Spiro, live from Israel, and myself, Ellie Bass, here in Canada. Um, we are, of course, talking about what everybody is talking about right now, which is we are really about to see this big showdown go on in American politics, probably one of the strangest election cycles we've ever seen. So, we wanted to talk a little bit today about the US and Israel relationship as it relates to the government policies, the rhetoric, and what that looks like. So we can get a little bit of a sense of what is the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and what have some of the past governments, presidents, administrations done, and what can we learn from the past in order to try to figure out how to go forward. And I guess just a caveat saying, well, this isn't about like telling people what to do on voting day, but this is really just trying to give you as much information as possible so that we can make educated decisions as Jews using the information and experiences from the past. So, Ken, where should we start when we start to talk about or think about the US in relation to Israel in our history?
Yeah, so first, Ellie, this is an amazing election cycle, and it's arguably one of the closest and certainly most, I could say, consequential elections. But it's good. Jews have traditionally, it's been an issue on everyone when they vote. They have a checklist of what's important to them, economy, foreign policy, border, like if you look what's going on in America, the economy, inflation, the border. But traditionally, and it's less so with the distancing from the Holocaust and the distancing of a lot of Jews from their Jewish identity, but a candidate's affinity or lack thereof for the state of Israel has played a big role in it, and it's interesting to see how that relationship has changed over time because people react to the reaction of people and their political affiliations has not kept up with how much that has changed since the emergence, the birth of the state of Israel in 1948. You can look at this in two ways. One is, the religious kind of Christian Zionist affiliation, which goes back much, much, much further. There's a lot of interesting books written on that. I always say, by the way, people who are interested in the books, the best ones to read are Michael Oren, who is former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He wrote a great book called Power and Faith. I think it's really the best book about this, the history of the U.S. Relationship with Israel that goes all the way back to the founding of the state. And then if people are interested in another great book, it's not directly related to America, but it's Barbara Tuchman's book, The Bible and the Sword, because it both deal with the kind of spiritual grassroots, Christian, redemptive, eschatological connection of Christians. In the case of Europe, it goes back like literally 500 years. But in the case of America, it even begins in the 19th century with people like, well, you can look up people like William Blackstone and even people like John Adams were, although their support for a Jewish state had much to do with the notion of Jews converting and Jesus coming. But I think that
Right.
the relationship that is more relevant to us, much more so, although with one, caveat that there's no question that Christian right plays a huge role in the political connection between Israel and the United States, which is, I think, what we really want to focus on. And that obviously begins, it's pre-state. America, we've talked about the history of Zionism and the birth of the movement in the late 19th century. And clearly, America was a sideshow. The American century is really a post-World War I phenomenon, and England was playing a more critical role with the Balfour Declaration and et cetera. But even with, the end of World War I, when world order really changes dramatically, so many things shift in the world, and so many countries appear, and the whole rise of nationalism and in the world in general, but also in the Middle East at this period of time, early 20th century. We see that U.S. support for Israel begins early on, even decades before there's a Jewish state. We have the first U.S. Supreme Court Justice, a Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, who was definitely a supporter of the notion of some sort of Jewish national entity, and Woodrow Wilson, who was the U.S. president at that time also. was a supporter of at the same time. And this is taking place precisely post World War II, around 1922, when you have, the Lodge Fish Resolution, which was passed by the U.S. government in 1922, precisely at the time when the British Mandate was kicking in.
And what was
So
that? What did that mandate say?
it was basically supporting a Jewish state. It came out, it was kind of like a vague support for the notion of some sort of Jewish political entity. This all gets threshed out as we go over the next few decades. Whether it would be a state or not, what exactly it would be is a much bigger discussion. But the point to focus on is there has been definitely American political interest in creation of a Jewish state and supporting the notion of some sort of Jewish political entity that goes back more like basically a hundred years ago. Um,
And why do you think that is? Why would the US, which is massive in terms of not just its size and its population, but also its political power and its military power, take interest in Israel, which is pretty much the size of New Jersey, and situated in the middle of the Middle East, thousands and thousands of miles away. Why would they even be discussing that in terms of creating a mandate or talking about it in Congress? What's the importance there?
Yeah, so it's part biblical. You can never disconnect, especially at this period of time. I mean, people never appreciate how Christian. It's significantly less so than it was, but 100 years ago, even 30 years ago, I mean, Christianity was the lifeblood of the United States
Mm.
as identity. It's a country that has, freedom of conscience in terms of religion, but the underpinnings of the United States are totally Christian. So part of it is that very deep understanding of the Jewish people's biblical connection to the land of Israel. Part of it was support for like a guy like Wilson, who was very big into like the League of Nations and like using world bodies and government to reshape the world. He was huge on this. And obviously Louis Brandeis being Jewish, that just came from. But also you have to appreciate that this is a period of time when the Jews in Europe had gone through. In the 1920s, this is the end of the mass migration of Jews to the United States, which was preceded by a period of massive persecution of Jews in what was Tsarist Russia. So there was a lot of like deep groundswell of grassroots support amongst political leaders around the world. We got to do something for these poor Jews. They're just being smashed. They've been bounced from place to place and they're suffering horrible persecution. And remember, Europe, Western Europe, America, they're liberal democratic countries. They're looking at Tsarist Russia, which was not, okay, this is already in 1922, it's become communist. But like, what can we do to ameliorate the situation? These poor Jews, there's some genuine sympathy. It's a
Mm.
combination of factors
So, meaning like
that
the US recognized the Jewish people as a minority that needed to be protected and had, Rahmanas on it. Like we had compassion on the Jewish people and said, hey, this is a minority in the world that we are um, supposed to be helping or supporting or protecting in some way. Is that accurate?
right. Yeah, and just as in the conscience of like the ancient, like, Zionist consciousness of how to deal with the Jewish question, which is what pushed to the creation of a Jewish state, believing that would be the solution. You have other people, thinkers in the world, be they spiritual, be they political, be they legal or philosophical, who are also focusing on that issue, that this is something that is not right, that these people are still suffering so much. So it's a combination of factors, absolutely. But we have to remember that the World War II, World War I leads to World War II, and America is now emerging as the superpower. And until then, had very little interaction in the Middle East. Besides, the only thing people are more familiar with is the theme song of the Marine Corps, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, because going back to the early 19th century when America was its inception, the U.S. shipping was suffering horribly off the coast of Africa at the hands of Barbary Coast pirates. But America wasn't involved physically in the Middle East, except for going into Tripoli with a marine landing and trying to take out some of the pirates who are interfering with shipping. With the end of World War II, we see that America emerges as the big player, the beginnings of really American superpower. Just such a great military might that's now projecting. It's already, as a consequence, America does play a role in World War I. It comes in at the end. It is. It does have a seat at the Treaty of San Remo, which was that international conference that took place in Italy in 1920, where the victorious Allied powers in World War One, we're talking about France and England and Italy and Japan, decided to create the modern Middle East. Primarily, it was the British and the French. America as was had observer status in that. But they really begin, if you fast forward to the end of World War II, and of course, the Holocaust plays a huge role in. I always say, and we've said this before, that even the darkest clouds in Jewish history and human history have silver linings. And I always say the silver lining of the Holocaust, if there's any such thing, you could even use the word, it even hurts to say it, but 6 million Jews dying, as it took, as you like quoting the book, the Horn's book, people love dead Jews.
Right.
6 million Jews dying got us enough sympathy to barely crexed out that support, that UN partition vote November 29th, 1947, to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. And now America is in a very different position in terms of its ability to influence affairs around the world. But the other really, really big change that's taking place in the world is the reordering of the world order. World War I led to the end of a lot of empires and the emergence of a lot of countries that didn't exist previously, with the collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and its impact on the Middle East, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its impact on Europe, especially in the South and the East, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and those things. But the reemergence of world order post-World War II is the Cold War,
Right.
which really takes off because it's the emergence with the defeat of Nazi Germany and Italy and Japan. Where the West meets the East is in Berlin. And now, now that smoke clears and the new conflict, which doesn't emerge into an all-out war, but will explode into a series of mini conflicts because of that idea of, mad, mutually assured destruction that the Soviet
Right.
Union and communism in general, which is larger than the Soviet Union, it's also in China, and the spread of communist regimes in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, will lead to all of these conflicts around the world, of which the Middle East will end up being a central flashpoint, because as a byproduct of now, what we have is two superpowers that are nuclear powers that can never, that's what MAD was about, mutually assured destruction. These countries can never fight each other directly because the consequences would be catastrophic for the human race. So
But then it
all of
results,
this
I think, in
comes
what you're saying
together.
is like all these little proxy wars, proxy skirmishes, proxy wars. So this way of sort of poking each other and asserting their dominance in different regions through these other countries fighting each other. But really, those countries are being backed either by Russia or by the United States, and they're kind of working out their stuff vicariously through other conflicts. And it sounds like what you're saying is one of those places is Israel, where Israel becomes backed by the United States, and all of the Arab states surrounding it have some kind of connection with Russia. Is that too simplified to say that, or
I
does
mean,
that fit?
no, it's not too simplified, but it takes a while to evolve. But again, the big change is those countries that had played such a big part in the creation of the Middle East, especially the British and the French, it's post-World War I with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They still have holdings there because they are, in theory, victorious, but they're also waning powers. That Britain is, after fighting two world wars, is not in great financial shape, to say the least. So they're divesting. And one of the, it's just a general rule in history, there's a rule in physics, nature abhors a vacuum.
Mhm.
Vacuums will be filled. And in the world of politics and geopolitical realities, vacuums tend to be filled by what's ever on the rise. And it happens to be that will fill the void caused by the collapse of kind of the colonial model of Western European power, will be the rise of the Soviet Union, which is more than one country because Russia subsumes into it Ukraine and all these in the Warsaw, and the creation of a bloc called the Warsaw Pact, and the emergence of the United States as the superpower, which single-handedly rebuilds Europe, largely in an attempt to keep communism from taking it over. It's called the Marshall Plan. But then you have the creation of NATO. And the meeting point is going to be literally, Berlin is a divided city, and you have Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And then you have flashpoints around the world, be it in Cuba, be it in South America, in various places, be it, of course, in Southeast Asia, first with the Korean War and then with the Vietnam War. So, but this is evolving over time because when we keep in mind the relationship that Russia, the Soviet Union, Khrushchev has with Israel, the Soviet Union voted in November 29th, 1947, along with the US to partition Palestine. There was initial Soviet support because Israel and the Middle East was up for grabs. Because when England and France basically pull out of the Middle East, who will now move in? And moving in no longer means like in colonial times, I invade and take over. That's just not like cool anymore, although it's definitely been done by countries since. But who can get this country into my sphere of influence for whatever geopolitical reasons there are? And the big reasons will be primarily oil, for sure, and geography, things like the Suez Canal. These are big things. This idea of big history that other things besides just personalities and events play a big role in history, geography and economics and things like that. And the US, the Middle East, another thing that oil was not something that was really used much in the world until World War I. The British switched their fleet over from coal to oil, and Britain was a huge naval power. And the centrality of the Middle East to the British becomes huge. And the Arab population of what is then not that many Arab states, but a large Arab, that's the whole emergence. We've talked about this, I think, before about the emergence of the modern Middle East, but these Arab countries will come out largely as a byproduct of the breakup of colonial European influence in the Middle East. But this idea of who we need to get on our side is going to play a big role in how people are going to decide things. And clearly in the mind of Russia that's trying to expand its hold and spread communism, which is an expansionist ideology, taking over the now forming modern Middle East into nation states and pushing them over to the side and replacing their Islamic ideology with maybe some sort of communist ideology is something on their agenda. And the US at the same time is thinking, yeah, oil is huge. Remember this oil, the emergence of the Middle East as a major oil exporter it gives them huge influence. And the US is thinking if we are robbed, if Western Europe is robbed of its energy supplies and has to rely on Soviet-controlled oil, whatever, and the control of the Suez Canal, this could have massive consequences for the growth and expansion of communism. And, so this becomes the major flashpoint.
It also sounds like, I mean, if we look at some of the trade options as well, just in terms of the US dominating the seas, making, seafaring trade and shipping possible. It's one of the things that we're seeing now where, in the Red Sea, with all of the Houthis attacking all of these different ships, they're having to reroute their ships around the Horn of Africa rather than going through the Red Sea, which is affecting prices, which is affecting trade. Like, it sounds like the US just, as far as becoming a global economy, established all of these connections with Middle Eastern countries, both for trade and for oil. And everything is now so tied together that Israel becomes one of the places that allows those ties to happen and be viable as a liberal democracy. Is that also true? And then what do we see in terms of, if we switch over now to what's happening in the US, how do different administrations or presidents relate to needing a connection in the Middle East somehow?
Right. So it kind of goes hand in hand. The relationship in Israel and America is not so clear cut at the beginning. What you're pointing at is very important. The world is very interconnected. Trade is very interconnected. And the ability to, especially in the case of the United States, to preserve stability, because that's what Western liberal democracies like to do, given that no democracy's ever gone to war with another democracy in human history. So it's in their best interest to secure vital strategic and economic interests and create strong, dependable allies. But this is a relationship that has evolved over a long period of time. And it's gone in fits and starts. We have to remember, if we go to 48, when the November 29th, 1947, the UN votes in Flushing Meadow in Queens 33-13 with 10 abstentions to partition Palestine, and the Arab world rejects it. And a lot of countries stand by and just watch what happens. But fast forward to less than half a year later, and England is gone, and now it's a vacuum. And the US, by the way, this is Harry Truman as president. Roosevelt's died. Truman's in office. This is post, he died at 45, and this is already 48. Truman, by the way, had a lot of affinity for a Jewish state. He had a business partner who was Jewish, who used some of his influence to get US support. But initially, the US warned Israel, like, you're gonna get trashed. Do not declare a state. And not to go into a whole discussion of what was going on in David Ben-Gurion, then to become the first prime minister's mind. He figured, carpe diem, we got to seize the opportunity.
Well,
So
what did they
against
want
the
them to do
wishes,
instead? What did the US
like
expect them to do?
hold off, not react immediately. You're not in a position. By the way, the world slammed an arms embargo in the Middle East, including the United States. Truman did that because we don't want to feed the flames. It's like there's a little fire. It's like a little barbecue. We're going to pour lighter fluid into this. The problem, of course, for Israel was that the Arabs, especially the Jordanian Legion, which was British run, British equipped, and British trained, by Pasha John Glubb, were in a far better position militarily, but thankfully not very coordinated in their attack against Israel. But on the surface, it seemed that it was, you're going to get slaughtered. You're going to get overwhelmed. There's like 600,000 of you, and there's like 45 million Arabs, and five, or depending on how you count, six Arab armies declare war and invade. This is not the time. But no, there was really no, when the British just pull out, they just create the vacuum. No one's willing to pull in. No, the America's not saying we're sending in troops now. No, 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 no. I mean, one of the things we see post World War I, especially World War II, is the abhorrence that liberal democracies have for getting involved in more wars. They have to be dragged in kicking and screaming, which is a strength and a weakness. So, but it wasn't like America immediately jumps in, we're supporting Israel. That process, like I said, both Truman and then Eisenhower are maintaining. There's a relationship there, but they're not openly supporting. Israel's original support, they had to smuggle in weapons, was the French. The French were the first people who were giving weapons to Israel. The
That
French gave
seems
Israel a lot of stuff.
deeply ironic at this point.
Yeah, deeply ironic, exactly. But not only that, but if you got to throw a lot of things in there, because then in 1956, if I have my dates correctly, Gamal Abdel Nasser, they overthrow King Farouk. So there's another like Arab monarchy gone, along with all the other ones that are going to go or have already gone in the Middle East that create the tumult we have today. He's overthrown by Nasser, who is a nationalist leader who nationalizes the Arab nationalist leader who nationalizes Suez Canal. And this gets the British and the French very upset because the Suez Canal was something that Europe built, and now the Egyptians are taking over, and they could choke off shipping like you see the Houthis doing. So, with the backing of Israel, people even know this. Suez, with the backing of with backing Israel, Israel goes and takes the Sinai and takes the Suez Canal. And America, Eisenhower got really upset at this. It was that he put a massive pressure. This is not happening. It could, because America is the big boy on the block, and it's like, I'm calling the shots. What are you doing going in there and doing this stuff? So Israel's forced to retreat, and Nasser has to open up the Suez Canal again. But it's interesting. The relationship is America comes down very hard on Israel, England, and France for that little Suez campaign thing, which was good practice for 1967, I guess, when Israel does it again in the Six-Day War. But you see the alliance is far from solid at that point. The event that really solidifies that alliance, and one of the real political personalities, because we've gone through Truman, we've gone through Eisenhower, is John F. Kennedy. And this, by the way, is corresponding to a very big switch in American politics, you should know, which people aren't really aware of. And it's not a class on American politics, but the Democratic Party is going through a switch to being a much more progressive party than it used to be. People don't realize that prior to that, the party of the old South of pro-slavery, whatever, it was the Democratic Party. The only members of the Klan who ever sat in the U.S. Congress were Democrats, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, ending slavery, giving blacks rights and the right to vote and everything. The Republicans vote for all that stuff, and the Democrats are against. You have a big switch where in that period of time, and this corresponds to the civil rights movement. It's way too much stuff to go into now, but the Democrats become the big supporters of the civil rights movement and all that stuff that's going on with breaking Jim Crow South and, with Selma and all the things, the movies people see in the early 60s is all during the time of John F. Kennedy and his brother, who's Attorney General Robert, but you have the Democrats emerging as that kind of progressive liberal party, And Kennedy really, first of all, he ends the arms embargo against Israel, which is good
What
time.
what is Kennedy's perspective on Israel? Does he speak about it openly? Is this something that's back channel?
Yeah, you
What
can
do we
know
know about
Kennedy.
his
I'm
view on the state of Israel?
Yeah, he had genuine support. He was a genuine progressive thinking guy who Israel was viewed. Come on, you have to remember this is early 1960s. This is not long after the Holocaust. Israel is viewed as a bastion of liberal democracy in a very tumultuous part of the world. And there's still a lot of, and Israel is still viewed as the David, not the Goliath. So a
Right.
combination of factors leads to a lot of grassroots support for Israel, and which still exists, at large in the American collective consciousness post-Holocaust. So it's not and Israel's really in a very precarious situation. We don't realize you come to Israel today and it's got the superpower army for a little country and a great economy, but this was not the state of Israel in the early 1960s when things were being rationed and all the military equipment was secondhand leftovers, a lot
Right.
of which had to be smuggled in by. But this sets the stage for what is the really big switch. Now, Kennedy, we know, is killed in he's 1963, and then who takes over is Lyndon Johnson, who he becomes president because the president is killed. But the background to the 67 war is the huge turning point when this relationship is truly solidified between America backing Israel, because it's during that 67 war that not only does Kennedy introduces the idea, he ends the embargo and he introduces the idea of a special relationship that America has with Israel, which at its heart is going back to the shared principles that we have talked about before in previous episodes of the only country emerging in the Middle East that is a democracy is Israel, very much built on the values. In America, as I've said many times, is kind of becomes the symbol where Israel becomes the source. When I say Israel, I mean traditional, the name of Israel as this ancient Jewish people, the author, brought the Bible to the world, but also the modern state of Israel, reborn, is in its same geographic piece of real estate, is becomes again that kind of symbol. And another thing playing into, as much as Israel is not really it's a Jewish state, but it's not a religious state. If you know the history of Israeli politics, but everyone associates Israel with the land of the Bible. And one of the things that's playing in the background is not just the Cold War, but what Russia, the Soviet Union, stands for, which is godless communism
Right.
versus the very strong biblical, religious affinity that a lot of American political personalities have towards the Bible. And, so it kind of like fits together really, really well into, Soviet influence, bringing its godless communism into the Middle East and trying to protect its power versus, the little David state of Israel as a bastion of democracy, the source of the Bible in the Middle East, as a bulwark in what now is becoming emerging, because, we have 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis, when, Cuba's already been taken over by Fidel Castro, and then the Russians, Soviet Union tries to put, ballistic missiles not that far off the coast. So it all kind of fits together, and it becomes not just an ideological, but a clear strategic interest where the battle lines finally get drawn in the 67 war. It all fits into place. That the West is going to be backing Israel, and Russia decides to make its move and move into countries like especially Egypt, the largest Arab state in the Middle East, and obviously other states in the region.
Is this a case of like my enemy's enemy is my friend? Meaning, it seems to me that the United States, as a liberal democracy, as a Christian liberal democracy, their values align with Israel. But when I look at, say, Russia, it certainly doesn't seem like godless communism or even the czarism I think that Putin is pushing for these days. I don't think it lines up with, say, an Islamic state or an Arab set of values. How does that work? Why is it that Russia ends up getting into bed with a culture that seems so absolutely opposite to what it represents?
Well, first of all, you should know that Arab nationalist movements, the Ba'ath Party, have toyed with socialist ideology. It hasn't really worked. They tend to revert back to their tribalistic Islamic kind of roots. Islam is a byproduct of Arab tribal clannish worldview, very much so. It comes out of that and its interaction with Judaism and Christianity. That's a whole other topic. But they did. I mean, it's always been in the interest of communist ideology to spread the revolution, but the like you said, my enemy's enemy is my friend, will take what we can get. And we know that if you see the emergence at this period of time, what's called the non-aligned states, that India is one of those countries that are not communist states and that are not Western European liberal democratic states, but kind of floating around. A lot of them are in Africa, things like that, that are mostly third world states. Russia sees this as an opportunity to it's kind of like a bad version of what the Chinese have done more successfully with their Belt and Road Initiative, sending in advisors. They put the Aswan Dam being built in Egypt, to regulate the flooding of Egypt, for better or for worse, not to get into the environmental consequences of that, but things like that, and doing projects in Africa. It's all just as China with its Belt and Road Initiative. It's not altruistic. It's not. It's all a way of getting influence and getting people on our side. What the long-term goal is, whether we're going to convert them. Clearly, at an ideological level, it seems to me that the communist regimes want to export their form of government. But bottom line, you have to begin with getting your foot in the door through making a connection, which is involved in giving people stuff so that they feel beholden to you, and getting influence, and literally you addicting people, just as a pusher addicts people to drugs. If I'm supplying all of your military hardware, which I give to you at a really nice price, you are now stuck with me because all the resupply and parts and replacement stuff is going to come from me, which we see doesn't always work. We see in Egypt now, it's the other way around. Egypt is American military equipment until after the 73 war, it was all the Soviet Union. So they did make a switch. So, but this is all coming into play. And it's not such a simple thing, by the way, because one of the things that Israel also got from France was the Dimona nuclear reactor, the nuclear program, which Shimon Peres was very involved in. And this was a huge point of contention with Kennedy because, with the post-World War II use of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union, then getting nuclear bombs, and then this whole, the superpower thing was based on, like we said, these two nuclear powers. The proliferation of nuclear weapons is something that's been very much on the mind of the world for more than a century now. And America was very not into the notion of nuclear weapons spreading to the Middle East. So when Israel did establish this nuclear reactor, which still sits in Dimona in the Negev, there was a lot of very intense exchanges between first Ben Gurion and later Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister after 63 until he died in 69, and Kennedy, who was murdered who's assassinated by Harvey Oswald in 63 in Dallas. But the U.S. was putting a lot of pressure to allow inspection. That issue, it's interesting what happened to it. People aren't even aware of that whole issue. I mean, it eventually kind of fizzled out with a little bit of inspection, but Johnson, when he became president after, did not push it. So enabled Israel, which has never openly admitted that it has nuclear weapons, to develop probably nuclear weapons. I don't know. I'm not privy to this either, but it's kind of like the worst kept secret in the world that Israel maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity. But that's a big thing already, because now you have a nuclear power in the Middle East, which is thankfully a democracy, because democracies don't. No, we can say America is the only country whose democracy uses a nuclear weapon, but it was in the middle of a war. But so that the whole rise of a nuclear Middle East continues to play a massive role in the geopolitical realities of the Middle East today, and Iran especially. So, but basically, all that little interesting thing aside, you have Johnson coming into play. But then if we fast forward, by the time we get into the late 60s, early 1970s, like the battle lines are really drawn. And then we have Richard Nixon, in 1972, who becomes president. And this is a switch because now you have a Republican in office. We're talking about everyone else is Johnson and, the Johnson, Kennedy, these are the Democrats. And now Republicans in office. Truman was, Eisenhower wasn't, but it's basically been Democrats running the show. And by this point, the it's interesting within American politics, American Jews are overwhelmingly have always voted overwhelmingly for the Democrats on a national level when it comes to presidents, congressmen, and senators. And Republicans have not had, it was always viewed as the old boys neck or the WASP power establishment, didn't have the greatest affinity for the Jewish state and the Jewish people. Nixon himself was no big fan of Jews, interestingly enough, but he was actually, despite the fact that he resigned in the Watergate scandal, in my opinion, he was actually a very good political leader for America, especially in foreign policy, opened up relations with China, for better or for worse in the future. But
How
but
many Jews were in America by the 1970s? Like I know now we're, approximately 2% of the population in America. It's like about what, 7, 8 million Jews. But in the 1970s, what do we know around what the Jewish population of America was, and how would that have played into the relationship of presidents or administrations in terms of their Jewish constituents?
yeah. Well, first of all, the population numbers I have to check. America, going back 50 years ago, Jews were a larger percentage of the US population. I think it peaked at a little over 2%. Now it's probably less than 2%, but there were probably numerically less Jews. But the other difference was that in going back to the time of Kennedy, the intermarriage rate was in the low single digits, and today it's in the high 70%. So you have more people who have Jewish ancestry but are no longer Jewish or are very disaffiliated. But the Jewish vote has always played a significant role in American politics. Thankfully, you could say the Electoral College, which was created not to give Jews political power, but to create it to even out the disproportionate impact that states could have on elections and it's not a popular vote in America. Jews have been highly concentrated in the states with the largest populations and tend to vote in very high percentages and therefore tend to be disproportionately impactful. But up until relatively recently, and still it maintains this way, Jews have always almost automatically voted Democrat. And there's a famous quote by a certain president who will remain nameless where he basically says, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway. Like why waste our time on them? Because they're kind of religiously committed to the Democratic Party. So it's played definitely somewhat of a role in Democratic politics because even if these people are only like 2% of the population, their impact in major states has been far larger. So we have to take that into consideration. And what's also changed dramatically, Ellie, is the priority that Israel plays in the collective consciousness of the American Jewish population. Like, where is it in the scale of what is important to me? Post-Holocaust, in a period of time when Jews were much more just Jewish in general, it was a much higher issue for people. It could be even the issue, up there, one or two. Like, what does this guy think of Israel? So a guy like Richard Nixon is not going to get a huge percentage of the Jewish vote. A guy like Lyndon Johnson, who chose not to run again, but was a progressive liberal, would be someone who Jews would naturally have an affinity for. But ironically, it's Nixon who had the first Jewish Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was not a great friend of Israel.
Yeah, fascinating.
Interesting. So the whole thing, it's a very complicated political situation. But we know then again that, in Kissinger, this is when Golda Meir is around now, because Levi Eshkol dies in office, and Golda Meir becomes the first female prime minister of Israel, and this leads to a second attempt. That was actually not the second attempt. It's the third major war, but 73 was not an attempt by the Arabs to destroy Israel. 48 was, 67 definitely was the Six-Day War. But by the way, it also leads to a reorienting of the image of Israel. Firstly, it's a big shakeup between 48 and 67. The Arab world got a big buckets of ice water in their face that Israel is a power to be reckoned with. Those Jews do fight, but it's the beginning of the awareness. 63 Israel, still the David. 73 Israel, scary situation. The Arabs were not trying to destroy Israel in 73. And this time it was only Syria and Egypt just trying to get a foothold back in territory that Israel had won in 67. So when the smoke cleared, they'd be in a stronger position to negotiate some sort of final deal. And they ended up doing much better than they thought they would because of the hubris, the pride, whatever, kind of like we saw this redux again in October 7th of last year of, like a massive failure of military intelligence. But Israel still, Israel was freaking out. There's a lot of speculation that, there were the nuclear weapons that Israel supposedly didn't have were being loaded onto the fighter planes because if it got to the point where as they used to call it, the secular, it's called the Third Temple, which they called the Jewish state, it was in danger of being destroyed. We're going to take these guys out. We're not going to, we'll nuke Damascus and Cairo if we need to. Of course, this is much speculation on that point. Tom Clancy wrote a book about this, The Sum of All Fears. It was a historical novel about it. But but during that war, we know that America comes out very strong because Israel took massive losses. That's a whole discussion of what Israel did wrong. But the Arab learned their lesson, and the Soviets were now supplying them up the wazoo with weapons and anti-aircraft missiles to compensate for Israel's aircraft superiority, like it has today with Hezbollah and everyone else, and also to take out the Israeli armor. And Israel lost a lot of tanks and a lot of planes and Nixon came out for Israel and did an emergency resupply that proved to be very critical for Israel. We'll replace everything you lose. And there's some speculation that even Henry Kissinger, he denied this, by the way, very late in life. He died at age 100, but there was some speculation that he actually, by some U.S., I forget which U.S. naval admiral, claimed that that Kissinger wanted Israel to bleed more, suffer more, not supply them too quickly, so it'd be more easy to push for some sort of political solution to the Middle East, which was just a dangerous flashpoint, which could erupt into something much, much bigger. We know the end of 73, Israel went and turned the tide and won a massive victory at a much bigger cost, but surrounded the Egyptian Third Army and could have starved them all to death. And the Soviet Union was threatening to use nuclear weapons. So America had to step in and say, okay, stop, we're doing a ceasefire, when Israel could have pretty much ended Egypt if it had wanted to. So you see how, again, it's this great interplay between the superpowers and how Israel's become really the center stage of what is a much more significant conflict than what was going on in Vietnam. The fear in a place like Vietnam was going to be the stepping stone, and then Japan might go communist. And that would be a huge loss. The economic power of Japan is emerging as a superpower economy in the world. But in the case of the Middle East, this could mean the whole thing goes red. Suez Canal, oil, Soviet Union takes over the Great Land Bridge between Africa and Asia. That's it, the domino theory. So that was a really interesting turning point where Israel held its ground. And that also leads to, again, but it also with right before in 72, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Egypt throws out its Soviet advisors, which leaves the door open. And you could see America, like a guy like Kissinger, thinking, here's an opportunity to turn the tide and take what is the largest Arab state, and turn it into an American ally, which is a game changer. So
Right.
lots of stuff going
So
on there.
yeah, you can really see the chessboard, of the US and Russia sort of working their stuff out through countries in the Middle East. So, okay, so let's go to the 80s and 90s. Then what
Right, right.
happens?
Right. So with that, and the Arabs were, but it's interesting. Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, he had a theory called the Iron Wall, which proved to be correct. He said the Arabs will only make peace with us, and they realize they can't destroy us. And Egypt, after, even though Egypt lost really the war in the end, they didn't end up with anything more than they had. And Israel was on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. They still viewed it as a victory because they were initially successful. And Anwar Sadat, who succeeded after Nasser, was able to basically reach out, and that you have Israel's, this is when the Likud has now taken over since 1977. A right-wing government led by Menachem Begin takes over, and you have the 1979. You have the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which is brokered
Who's the
by Jimmy
president at
Carter.
that time?
Jimmy
Jimmy
Carter.
Carter. Okay, got it.
Jimmy Carter. Yeah, this is the Camp David. This is a really, really huge thing. And this really breaks the ice because even though it's a cold peace and whatever, that's the beginning. But this is when the U.S. really, the whole kind of peace process thing starts taking off. And this is going to be a theme that's going to be running. But it's also, we're going to see the wane of Russia as the major power for a couple of decades, and America really moving in and being the big player in the Middle East, backing Saudi Arabia and getting control of the oil assets. By the way, as a byproduct of the 1973 war, the Arabs, they have the Arab oil embargo, which goes till March of 1975. I remember this. They were rationing gas in the United States, odd and even license plates. And people saw this was further, flexing. And the whole time, by the way, the State Department this whole time is like, forget, forget Israel. We got Arab oil, Arab political, Suez Canal. They're always playing they're always siding much more with there's a deep-seated, you can make a good case for animus that the State Department has had historically for the state of Israel, but that's a huge topic.
So it sounds like what
But
you're saying is partly what's happening is there's an economic consideration to side with the Arabs because of the need for oil, that there's an ideological consideration which causes the presidency or the administration to side with Israel because it's a liberal democracy, and those two things clash a lot. Is that accurate? And is that still happening?
I mean, liberal democracy only goes so far. America's backed any number of countries that have not shared its political ideology for strategic, concrete interests. Bottom line, that's the deciding factor in most relationships. With Israel, it's always tricky because there is that deep emotional connection, but it's also combined with a lot of things going on, the geopolitical realities of wanting to have access to the oil, of pushing what was the Soviet Union out, which eventually will cease within a decade plus to exist at all, which is a huge change, which creates another vacuum. But it's just this is our chance. But not only that, let's stabilize the region of the world, which has been historically very unstable. And it's also, but the background also that's running is the emergence of Israel as a real powerful country. And with 67, you have the birth of the settler movement and the resettlement of Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and the reorienting in the wind with the kind of, I would say, diminishing of the residual guilt for the Holocaust, the emergence, the secularization of a lot of Europe. And there's so many things at play here. A lot of the guilt-related support that Europe and America has for Israel is starting to wane. Israel can stand on its own. The birth of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964, we're going back in time, but that was created by the Soviet secret police through Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, to create an alternative kind of moral claim on the Middle East and reorient the conflict to taking Israel from the David to the Goliath, to kind of win over the emotion, pull on the emotional heartstrings of the left of Europe, which is the weak side. Let's play on that. That's a whole other huge topic, but let's play on the liberal left and because we see emerging today, the whole intersectional thing. You see it in full bloom today. Who's ever bigger, stronger is always wronger. There's only victims and victimizers. You see this now. 40 years ago, this was nowhere near as clear, but boy, did that work well. Now Israel's viewed as a colonialist occupier. Fast forward, and the indigenous people are being oppressed, or the Palestinians, even though it's a complete misunderstanding of the geopolitical historical realities of the Middle East. But there's a lot of stuff going on. But this is when you have multiple attempts by Jimmy Carter. And then you have, by the way, Ronald Reagan, who comes in, who's the other huge pusher of Reagan being a Republican and being a great confronter, much more conservative, in his worldview, much more like he's the forerunner in many ways of the kind of Trump kind of idea of making America great, standing up for liberal democracy. Reagan, really strengthens the alliance. He creates this idea of, this whole idea of a special relationship with Israel. He puts in the advanced stockpiling of American military supplies in Israel to be used by America. Like that, this is when the term like Israel becomes the U.S. like land-based aircraft carrier. The recognition, and then remember, now when Reagan's around, the Soviet Union is still there, but they've proven to be our steadfast ally. And these are people we can rely on with the changing winds of the Middle East and political instability. Israel's a democracy. Democracies are stable. Israel's values are similar to ours. Reagan was all into this stuff. And he did a full court press on containing and ultimately ending the Soviet Union. So he will really, really push to make Israel, by the way, a major non-NATO ally, which was done with Egypt also, realizing that Egypt, the largest, Sunni Arab state, is to get them fully in our court is going to be huge. So you have a complete political realignment now, and this is corresponding to the waning power of the Soviet Union in general and the waning power of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. So so that he's a huge personality. By the way, the one thing Israel does during the time when Reagan's president is take out Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981, which he did not like, because Israel's always maintained a policy. If we learned from the Holocaust that when people say they're going to destroy us, we're going to take that seriously. So refusing to allow an Arab state to have nuclear weapons has been a red line for Israel since then. And
It seems like
yeah,
it seems like a fascinating friendship, meaning like the US kind of likes to think that it's running the show in Israel and in the Middle East to a certain degree. And at the same time, Israel's like, yeah, but we're also our own person. We're also going to make
yeah.
our own decisions. We're going to consult with you, but you don't run Israel. And we are going to do what is in the best interests of our people on the ground, which is a really interesting relationship with the US. I think the US, in some ways, was sort of used to people just listening to them. Is that accurate?
Yes, for sure. But along with it's, I always say the greatest double-edged sword is U.S. foreign aid for Israel. Israel is the greatest recipient of foreign aid. A lot of it is military aid to the tune of something like $160 billion since it began. And, but that aid comes with a lot of influence attached to it, a lot of strings attached to it. First and foremost, it's largely a stimulus package for American military industrial complex because a huge percentage of the aid is spent in the United States buying planes and equipment. By the way, it's also caused Israel to stop manufacturing a lot of stuff that now we realize we should be manufacturing, like shells and things like that. We'll just get it from America. We got to spend the money, and it's given on the proviso to be spent in the United States, but it gives America a massive amount. We've seen this so much since October 7th, when during the Biden administration they slow walked aid to Israel and bureaucratic stuff, and we need the bunker buster bombs, and there's going to be a lot of changes after Israel. I think is going to go back to making a lot of its own munitions, recognizing that even this relationship, I say it has more strings attached to it than Pinocchio. It's a blessing and it's a curse. It solidified the relationship, but it limits Israel's ability to act independently. It's such an obvious point. We've seen this in the last year so strongly. It gives America a lot of influence and pull over Israel. Ultimately, there are certain red lines. We've seen this with Bibi Netanyahu in Iran, especially during Barack Obama's time, when the whole reorientation, because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a real vacuum created, and America was kind of free to operate, but it kind of corresponds to America really pushing for a peace process and also kind of pulling out to a large extent of the Middle East and wanting to, and the emergence of, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the vacuum that was created by the Iranian Revolution in '79 was the emergence of Iran as a radical jihadi Shiite. I wouldn't call them a superpower because they're really not, but definitely a very into exporting the revolution and moving into the Middle East and being a very big destabilizing force in the background. So we now have a brand new kind of mess. But Iran, which is in its ideology not only committed to exporting the Shiite revolution to the world, but also dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state, has tried to go nuclear also. And whereas when you get to, and the world has been very ineffective at keeping Iran from doing that. But when you get to Barack Obama, we see a shift in the policy where they're really allowing Iran to inch its way forward and trying to buy it off and not success. We saw Bibi really step in when Barack Obama was president and go against his wishes to go right to the Congress to appeal and explain how dangerous that will be. And that is really a major switch. If we're getting up to modern times, everything that's happened until then, the big switch is when Obama becomes president. And 2009, 2017, it's a combination of his different vision of the Middle East and really moving towards rapprochement on a certain level with Iran, and his animus towards Bibi Netanyahu, which created a tremendous amount of tension. To be fair to Barack Obama, he gave a lot of military aid to Israel. It's not so clear cut. He was a very big supporter of, but a lot of pressure was put on Israel. But along with what was ushered in with Obama and the political scene in America, with all this intersectional stuff and the victims versus the victors and the oppressed versus the oppressors, and how we look at the world as a very, what's the word, binary way, Israel has now fallen almost completely in a huge segment of the American body politic into the oppressor and the aggressor. It's a significant change in American politics, which has had a significant impact, which continues to reverberate today in the policies of the current administration. And
Well,
so
I
that
think
was.
I think it's also interesting because in that time, once you have a psychological viewpoint of life where people are either victims or aggressors or oppressed and oppressor, part of the challenge of living in the neighborhood that Israel lives in is you have to project power and aggression in order to have security. Meaning, if you project yourself as weak or as a victim, you'll be mowed over in the shuk as well as like militarily. On one hand, like Israel adopted a stance as a powerful military force in the Middle East in order to survive. But then that narrative plays out as an oppressive military or a Goliath rather than a David in the North American weird way of looking at the world where you're either a victim or you're the oppressor. So it's a strange thing. Like it's one of the reasons I think we run into you can't put an American lens on the Middle East because in the Middle East, even though Israel is the minority, meaning like surrounded by millions and millions of Arabs that would love to see it wiped off the face of the earth, but it's gotten really good at projecting itself as a power because that's the only way you're going to survive in that neighborhood. But that plays to an American audience that you're a colonial oppressor. And I think it seems like that's the double bind we're kind of in. We either project ourselves as victims and then we get mowed down in our own neighborhood, or we project ourselves as a power and we're mowed down in North America. Is that an accurate kind of look at the thing? It seems like a really crazy bind to be in.
It is, but you're right, because Israel, I mean, first of all, Israel can't afford the luxury of let's kind of rebrand ourselves as the losers here. We now Israel has to project its power out of necessity, as Golda Meir said. I think it was Golda Meir. I'm not sure. Like, the Arabs can lose 1,000 wars. We can't lose one. So we have to. So it's just by, thank God, God runs the world. And also, Israel's, our backs against the wall and our technological edge. And even, by the way, the U.S. played a big role in that, ensuring this doctrine of Israel should have this edge, which America has for a long period of time, like selling the first F-35s exported to anyone go to Israel first when they need to maintain their edge. So there's a kind of a baseline of support. But within that part of the American society that has kind of bought into this intersectional narrative, Israel falls on the wrong side, even though it is a gross misreading of the geopolitical realities and causes these crazy alliances of people like radical Islamists with Queers for Palestine. That's a whole level of insanity. But what we see now, the big, big, big change is very interesting in terms of American relationship with Israel. We saw it begins with the democratic relationship going back to the pre-state early years, and then Nixon coming in, and the Bushes are holding. But we've seen the switch in the last few decades as the Republican parties become more the party of the Christian right, the conservatives, and they've kind of switched roles, the Democrats, Republicans, in a lot of ways. The reality is that there's always been a certain level of pretty much across the board Democratic, the aisle Republican support, but it's really, really, really been the big change has really taken place since Barack Obama. It's been since 2009. It's been happening slowly, but it really exploded then because this whole intersectional thing has really taken off since then. That you now have a big switch where if you look at the Pew Research studies, it's not me speculating on this, that now we know while there's still strong Democratic support for Israel, it's down to around 50%. Whereas Republican support for Israel has now, because that's the conservative working class Christians who play a huge role. There's tens of millions of evangelical Christians. America has the largest evangelical population. And we talked about them at the beginning, but they're still very much there. They're very committed to Israel for various reasons. But they know that God says in the Bible, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And, they want to be blessed for supporting Israel. So you now have a significant difference between Republican and Democratic support. And you saw this, by the way, with, Donald Trump was a very interesting example of that, who, by the way, politically is not a conservative traditionally, but he ran as a Republican presidential candidate. He's the person who finally, even though in 1995, the US Congress voted to move the embassy to Jerusalem, every president was pushing that off, Republican and Democrat, till he did it in 2017. He finally did it, and he recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, and he cut off aid to UNRWA, and he came out. He was like full throttle in for supporting Israel, recognizing that he had a lot. I mean, there's a lot of clarity that this is a real ally of ours. We need to stand behind our allies, and what's good for Israel is good for the United States. And that, by the way, is a very true rule, because going back to the very original point of affinity, America is the symbol and Israel's the source of values, and America is, in many ways, Israel's aircraft carrier, the bulwark against all the craziness of the Middle East, which continues to be just as crazy as ever before. But America is stalwart. I always say it's interesting that Israel is the only country in the world where saying it's like America is the highest compliment. There's countries that fear America, imitate America, envy America, but the French are never going to say it is like America. No way. They think America is McDonald's. It is low culture. The British also, they respect America. We're good allies and close friends, but it's a very different level of relationship we don't see anywhere else in the world. And it's going through a huge transformative period of time now. And I'm really afraid to see what's going to happen, because there really is the biggest change in American attitudes towards Israel is happening before our eyes today. And it's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary to see how that's going to play out, which is why these elections are very significant for the world in general, the United States, but also for what's going to be with the Middle East, of who's going to step up and stand up against Iran, which is now filled in that vacuum and is a very dangerous destabilizing force, which must be controlled if we want to see the world, not degenerate, devolve into something very, very scary and dangerous.
Right. Yeah. I think there's so many complicating factors, and it's very hard as a Jew, I think, to just say, well, I'm only voting on Israel. You have to also look at so many other pieces of the picture. And at the same time, in a world where anti-Semitism is exploding onto the scene, where a lot of Jewish voters are voting on safety. It's one thing when you feel safe in your home country, where you can then take a look at, Maslow's hierarchy of need, where you can vote based on economics, you can vote based on ideology, you can vote based on rights. But right now, I think a lot of Jews that I speak to are voting on safety. Is this government going to make my life safer in some way? And if not, and the relationship between, Jews who support Israel and that feeling that there is a home base for Jews to get to if things get too dangerous in the diaspora. Like, I think that's a huge factor that is playing a part in perhaps this election more so than any other in recent memory, where Jews are,
Right.
it is a fear-based vote, and understandably so. So it's a very confusing time. I think a lot of Jews feel very politically homeless and wondering if their government is actually going to have their back. And that's a very unusual experience after 80 years in North America, where things have been kind of a little bit of that golden age. Not to say there hasn't been anti-Semitism, but certainly not the levels of what we're seeing now, and enough to press people to say, am I voting for somebody who is going to make it that I don't feel afraid to wear a Magen David, outside of my shirt, or wear a kippah in the streets, or, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I say, Israel might be America's aircraft carrier, but it's the Jewish people's lifeboat.
Right.
And just one more. It's interesting. You're right, because bottom line, most American Jews, their first thing is not going to be, the America's relationship with Israel. But I think it's worth closing with the thought of the book I mentioned before by George Gilder called The Israel Test, which is actually a much deeper point, going back to the very beginning of this whole conversation about the connection. And to paraphrase George Gilder, he says the number one issue that really is dividing the world is what you think about Israel. Between leveler egalitarianism versus people. It's like your whole kind of worldview. Israel is the litmus test for that.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, you show me what a country thinks of Israel, and I'll tell you all about their ideas about free market capitalism or liberal democracy. And I said it's not an accident that countries like, that you can see now it's really coalescing around the new coalition of outcast states that are fighting. You have this crazy, speaking of crazy relationships, you have Russia with Korean troops now fighting in the Ukraine, and Korea and China and Iran.
North
This is the
Korean, North
strangest.
Korean,
North
like
Korean, North
that,
Korean
right?
troops. Yes,
It's wild.
North Korean troops. But I mean, this is the strangest bedfellows who are united by one thing: fear of the West, primarily in in America. Overwhelmingly, that's the issue. So, these it's not an accident that a lot of these countries are the countries that hate Israel the most, because bottom line, when you strip everything away, Democrat, Republican, all other issues, it really comes down to what Israel stands for. It's not it's a state for Jews. It's not a state that's run on Jewish law, but it's still, with all of its issues and problems, is still solidly based and founded on a biblical, Jewish moral, ethical vision that has become the foundational vision of Western liberal democracy. So how an individual in a state looks at that says a lot about how they look at themselves and their values and where they see them going and their countries going. So it is really, in many ways, a critical issue on a much deeper level than many of us appreciate, far more than geopolitical.
Fascinating. Amazing. Okay. Thank you so, so much. I think this is just, we wanted to do something timely and relevant. So please, as always, feel free to reach out, comment. If you're listening on Spotify, there's a place where you can leave comments, you can rate, you can review, you can share. Please go ahead and do so. Don't hesitate to reach out to either Ken or myself if you have questions. All of the contact info is in the liner notes. I wanted to just mention that the Jewish history course begins tomorrow. That's Thursday, October 31st, with Ken Spiro at 12 noon Eastern Time on Zoom. Anyone is welcome to join us if you'd like to take part. It is a live class with Ken where you'll not only be taken through some of the essential pieces of Jewish history, but you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions about both things that are part of the course or anything outside of the course as well. If you have questions about something we talked about on the podcast, this is your chance to ask some of those questions. So please sign up if you want to join us for the course. Otherwise, I think that's it for today. Ken, thank you so much. And we're going to see over the next
Thank
couple
you,
of weeks
Ellie.
what's happening. You're going to be also traveling. So you'll be in North America during the month of during the month of November. So stay tuned and be in touch to find out where Ken is speaking if you want to go and see him live. And we will report back any other news as we go along if you want to get in touch with us. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you, Ellie. Take care. All the best, everyone.